Greetings students and welcome to this lesson on ethical theory. Now this will only be an overview. These issues are obviously more complicated and there's a lot more that can be said about them. So this is just an overview. This is what we will do in this lesson. First we'll talk about some questions to consider that ethical theory raises. Then we'll go through the various theories and issues themselves. And then we'll wrap it up with our conclusion. And I put a compass on this slide because basically ethical theory is like a compass when you are navigating through the woods, taking a hike for instance. A compass will help you know how to get around. It'll help you know how to reach a destination, and it'll also help you know how to kind of navigate around when you are there. And that's basically what ethical theory is to ethical issues. So for instance, when you encounter abortion or when you encounter the death penalty, ethical theory is kind of all the background information you need to know about how ethics is done and what are some of the issues involved in doing ethics. So it's like your compass for the ethical issues. So now let's talk about some questions to consider. Ask yourself this: is lying always wrong? When is it okay to break the law, if ever? Should we live for today only and not worry about the long term? Who exactly sets up the rules for what is right and wrong? How do we know what's right and wrong? Another question could be, is every act selfish ultimately? Are we only acting in our self-interest, or is there true selflessness somewhere, somehow? Another question that's particularly important in the wake of the Iraq War is torture ever justified? We know President Bush had a very hard time with people asking him this, so we need to ask ourselves, is torture ever justified? If so, when? And if not, why? And perhaps the hardest question is, does what is moral vary? Ultimately, are all moral ideas or moral positions relative to a time and place and a situation? Or are there some absolutes? That's perhaps the hardest question to consider. So these are the options and issues we'll be covering. Relativism, subjectivism, the use of religion in ethics, egoism, the social contract theory, utilitarianism, absolutism, and then the feminist contribution of the ethics of care. And then we'll end with the virtue ethics. So let's jump right into relativism. Basically, the basic idea of relativism is this: different cultures have different moral codes. So relativism claims that ethics are relative to individuals, groups, cultures, and societies. Now obviously you can tell that relativism resists universal moral norms. And some examples of the Eskimo cultures. Some Eskimo women ended up killing half of their children, and to Westerners that seems absolutely ridiculous. But the relativism would claim, no, look, different cultures have different moral codes, and it wasn't a big deal in their culture. Also, there was a difference between ancient Greeks and ancient Galatians. The Galatians ate their dead, whereas the Greeks thought that was horrible. They couldn't imagine eating the dead people among them. So relativism says, look, different cultures have different moral codes. That's the basic idea. Now it has also been criticized. For one, it's self-defeating. It's like saying there are absolutely no absolutes. Now why can't you say that? Well, because in the act of saying it, you are saying an absolute statement. It ultimately defeats itself. It's also criticized because just because some people believe something doesn't make it true. If I believe it's okay to eat the dead, or if I believe it's okay to kill an infant, that does not make it true. Similarly, if I believe that abortion is wrong, or I believe that the death penalty is wrong, that doesn't make it true. It has to depend on more than our beliefs. It has to depend on good reasons. Now, our beliefs might be informed by good reasons, but they are, although related, they are distinct. And the last criticism of relativism is it calls into question kind of any notion of moral progress. If everything is relative, then there's no sense of progressing morally as a society. So how do we get around relativism? We can talk of shared values. some moral rules must be embraced by everyone for a society to exist or a culture to exist. Some of those are honesty or the prohibition of murder, etc. So when we look back at the Eskimo culture, we can see that sometimes they killed their children because the conditions were harsh, and if they didn't, they would not be able to take care of all the children they had equally well, and so it was considered a mercy killing in that culture, and it was only a last resort. So there are, the shared values there are taking care of the society's young, and so how do you take care of your young? If you don't have enough time or resources or food to take care of all of them, then it is an act of mercy to put some of them, to take away the option of some of them to die from starvation. So the thinking goes. You may disagree, and that's totally fine. A lot of people in the West do, but just so that you know, there are shared values that we can talk of, even if some practices are relative to culture and time and space. Okay, next, subjectivism. Basically, the idea here is that morality is based on our feelings, not objective facts or proofs. Subjectivism says there are no moral facts, and no one is right and no one is wrong. People just feel differently, and that's all there is to it. And this theory kind of evolved from kind of a simple subjectivism into a full-blown theory called emotivism. So let's talk about both of those. David Hume, philosopher, said that morality is, when you say something is moral, all you're basically saying is, I approve of this. Now, this simple subjectivism was criticized for its inability to handle real disagreement and for implying that we're always right. When I say, for example, if I thought the death penalty was wrong, if I say the death penalty is wrong, basically David Hume would say that all that I'm really saying is I disapprove. And if someone else says the death penalty is right, Hume would say that all that they're saying is that they approve of it. So that it can't really handle disagreement. There's a real disagreement there that simple subjectivism just can't handle. Now, the next phase of it was advanced by a guy named Charles Stevenson. He said moral language is about influencing others' behavior, and some statements aren't true or false. For example, if I tell you to close the door, that's not true or false. It just what it is. It's a command. Now, emotivism was criticized because it can't account for true and false moral statements. Certainly, we do want to say that some moral statements are true and false, or at least better and worse, and emotivism can't account for that. Okay, now let's talk about using religion in ethics. Now, this has been an issue ever since, and probably before, but it was given a lot of attention through one of Plato's books called The Euthyphro. The Euthyphro problem is basically this. Socrates asks the character named Euthyphro, is an action right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's right? It might seem like wordplay to you, but it's actually a really profound question. Is an action right because God commands it, or does God command it because it's right? The basic idea behind using religion is that God has told humans how to live, either through direct commands or through the natural world. Now, this has given way to two ideas, two different theories. One's called the divine command theory. And the divine command theory says that the morally right thing to do is a matter of being commanded by God, and the morally wrong thing to do is a matter of being forbidden by God. And the other theory is the natural law theory. Now, this is the dominant theory because of some criticisms we'll talk about in a second, but this is the dominant theory in religious ethics. It says that God built certain features into nature, and so nature is a guide as to what's right and wrong. Now, it has been criticized by a host of people. Obviously, atheists will reject it for ethics, and that picture there is a guy named Christopher Hitchens. He's one of the prominent atheists of our time. Another criticism is that it's too mysterious. We can't say exactly how it works. and that's not good enough for a theory of ethics. Another criticism, actually, is that some actions are inconceivable as right or good. In other words, we want to say that rape and torture and any one of a nefarious act is we can't conceive that as right, and so if that could become right by God saying it's right, well, that's one of the criticisms of it. A fourth criticism is that it makes God's actions or preferences arbitrary. We want to think that God does things for a good reason, but if God just kind of decides arbitrarily what's right and wrong, well, that doesn't sit well with us. And last is that religious people themselves are divided on what's right, and so there are so many different ideas out there, and so how can we decide, well, whose religion? Which version of what's right? That's another criticism of the divine command theory. A criticism of the natural law theory is that what's natural isn't always good. We say disease is natural. We say tsunamis and hurricanes are natural, but they're not always good. They cause a lot of pain and suffering. So that's one reason why natural law theory doesn't work, so the critic will say. Another thing the critic will say is just because something is a certain way doesn't mean it ought to be. Yes, women can get pregnant through sexual activity, but it doesn't mean that sexual activity ought only to be used for reproductive purposes. That's one of the criticisms of natural law theory. Now, there are difficulties in using the Bible in ethics, and my point here is not to obliterate anyone's faith. By no means am I interested in doing that. It's just to mention some of the standard critiques that you'll hear of people that people give for using the Bible in ethics. You may find that the Bible is your standard, and that's totally fine. That is your decision. But these are some of the common critiques, so you need to be ready for them. People say that the problems we face today, are different than those faced thousands of years ago when these texts were written. For example, they had no concept of stem cell research. They had no idea of abortion in the way it's used today. So yeah, our problems are different than those faced thousands of years ago. Second is a second difficulty in using the Bible in ethics is that Scripture authorizes some things that we consider unethical, like slavery. It doesn't condemn slavery. It doesn't condemn the subordination of women. So that makes using the Bible kind of tricky for ethics. And the last criticism you'll hear is that Scriptures appear to contradict themselves. The New Testament focuses a lot on love thy enemy, love everyone, essentially. Whereas the Old Testament, there's a reason why it's considered the Old and New Testament. The Old Testament, God appears to these critics to be more like very interested in war and justice and fairness and doing what's right, whereas Scriptures appear to be more, the New Testament appears to be more loving, things of that nature. Now, there are certain advantages to using religion and ethics, and this will be the last thing until part 2 of this lesson. One advantage is it absolutely solves the subjective and objective problem. God would be the ultimate objective viewer, so there isn't this worry that what we're doing is too subjective, because if God is the standard for what's right and just and fair, then the subjective objective problem goes away. A second advantage of using religion and ethics is if God exists, chances are pretty good that God knows what's best and would want us to know, whether it's through commandments, the divine command theory, or through natural laws, which was the natural law theory. Depending on the presuppositions you bring, it'll probably influence what you'll be willing to say about using religion in ethics. Okay, at this point, go to the second part of this lecture in the other clip.